This is a simple pot. It's a homemade pot. It's a pot that looks exactly like a pot from prehistoric times. Such a simple thing is really, really important to archaeologists for understanding the past. And there are several reasons for this. One of them is because pots changed through time. And so by looking at the style of the pot, the archaeologists can tell how old it was. And if it's found with other things, they can tell how old those things are as well. Secondly, the pots can tell us quite a lot about the people that made them. So the designs might have had special meanings, or the designs and patterns and the type of pot that was made might tell us which part of the country or which part of the world they come from. And even the way that the pots were made, not just what they look like, but how the clay was mixed up and things like that, can tell us about the background of the person and where they may have come from. We also know a little bit about what the pots were used for, and there are some very clever ways to find this out. One of the things is that if you cook food in a pot, sometimes some of the food will get burnt. It goes a bit crusty and gets burnt to the inside of the pot. And if that happens, then that crusty burnt food usually doesn't rot away. Even if the pot is left in the ground for thousands of years, the crusty burnt food might still be stuck to the side of the pot. And that's great for archaeologists because that means that they can use a technique called radiocarbon dating, which is a special way of measuring the chemical makeup of the crusty residue, we call it, the burnt food, that allows you to say exactly how old it is. And that gives us a very good idea how old the pots are. Prehistoric pots look very different. They don't all look the same. So this little copy of a prehistoric pot that I've got here has got a round bottom and it's got a decoration that's made by twisted cord being pushed into the clay. And this one has got a flat bottom and it's got a decoration where somebody has actually scraped lines into it. They've impressed or incised lines and little jab motifs into the clay as well. And there are different reasons why pots are different shapes. Some of them are just fashion because pots change through time and people get different ideas. But also pots are very useful for showing perhaps what group of people you belong to or what your status is. And some of the patterns on the pots probably had special meanings as well. So there are designs that we find on some types of pots, which we also find on things like the walls of prehistoric tombs made out of big rocks that we call megaliths. And recently, scientists have used a very clever study of what's called ancient DNA. This is chemicals inside your body that control your cells, and they've used the ancient DNA to discover where people's relatives and ancestors came from. And we now know for certain that there was a huge movement of people from Europe into Britain at the beginning of what we call the Neolithic, the late Stone Age, the last part of the Stone Age. So it was people from continental Europe that brought the idea of pottery with them, as well as lots of other ideas such as farming and building big monuments, the most famous of which is probably Stonehenge. What I'm doing here is I'm making a replica, a copy of an ancient Neolithic pot. Now, the Neolithic was the time at the end of the Stone Age when people started keeping animals and growing crops. So they became farmers, but they still didn't have any metal tools. They had to make all their tools out of stone or other natural materials. And clay and pottery was a very, very important material for them. Now, to make a pot like that, the first thing you have to do is you have to find some clay, which is a natural material. You can find that by digging into the ground in certain places, and it looks just like this, nice and squishy when it comes out of the ground. And if you've got any clay near where you live and you want to try and make a pot, you can always check whether the clay's good enough by making a little sausage, just wrap it round your finger, and if it doesn't crack, then that means it's good enough for making pots out of. You actually have to mix some coarse material, something like sand or broken, crushed up shell or bone or something like that, old bits of broken pot that you've ground up, you have to mix that into the clay because that makes the pots a little bit stronger, and it means that when you put them in a fire, they're much less likely to break. Once you've mixed the clay up and you're ready to go, what you do is you make a little ball of clay in your hand, and you can put a small hole in it with your thumb like this, and then you can just squidge the clay so that it starts to begin the pot. There we are, it's just starting to look like the very bottom of the pot. But that's not very good on its own, that's far too small. So the next thing I do is I make a sausage of clay and I join that onto the pot and I start making it a little bit higher. And that's what I did here earlier on. I've put 3 or 4 sausages of clay on and I've squidged them and moulded them and made them the right shape. And now I'm nearly ready to finish. So I've got one more little roll of clay just here, which I'm just finishing off. I'm going to make sure it's exactly the same thickness all the way along its length. And then I'm going to put that on the top to make the rim of the pot. So I'm not all covered in mud for nothing, because I've been sitting like this with this nice round pot. I'm going to put a little bit of water, which I've got in this bucket, just on the top there. And I am going to just alter the shape of the rim a little bit so that I can put the little sausage of clay onto the top. I've just put on the last of the coils, and what I'm doing now is I'm making sure that it's the right shape for the style of pottery that I'm making. And as soon as this is the right shape, I'll be able to think about decorating the pot. And now I'm going to show you how to do a little bit of decoration. Well, the tool I've been using so far has been this spatula, which is quite useful for hitting the pot and making the walls of the pot, as we call them, nice and firm. But prehistoric people decorated their pots in lots of different ways, and they used lots of different tools. They would use things that they would find lying around in the environment. So the end of a feather there is quite good for making lines in the pot, or little jab marks. They might have used little wooden tools. That's a small wooden knife, which again is quite good for making lines. And we also find patterns that are made with combs. Now, they're not the sort of combs that you would use to comb your hair. They're really just bits of bone or wood that have had little nicks made in them, and you can use these to go around the edge of the pot and make nice straight lines of little holes. So combs like that are quite common too. I'm going to use something that goes by the lovely name of a cord maggot. Now, it's not actually made out of maggots, it's made out of cord, a twisted string. And it's a funny little tool. It's actually a piece of string that's had a second piece of string twisted round and round and round and round. So it looks almost as if the string is just coiled up. And this was used quite often on this type of pot, Peterborough ware pottery. And you wrap it around your finger and you just press it into the clay and it makes quite an attractive little shape. Here we go. I shall go round and make a little line of cord maggots like this, just like they did in Neolithic times. One of the things archaeologists don't know a great deal about is what fuel was used to fire the pots. What did they burn when they were trying to turn the raw clay into proper pottery? Most people think that they were probably using wood, and wood does burn very well and it burns at a very high temperature. But of course, you might need wood for fires for cooking and for heating as well. And you could quite easily run out of wood fairly quickly. So wood's very good, but I don't think it's the best fuel to use. One fuel that does work very well is this, and it looks a little bit like dried mud, but it's quite hard. And this is actually peat. So it's boggy material from moorlands, and the moss that grows on the boggy ground, it dies and it sinks down into the water, but it doesn't rot. Instead, it just gets squashed and squashed and squashed. And if you dig it up and dry it out, then because it's made of organic material, things that used to be alive, that means it will actually burn. And I think this is a very good fuel, but I don't like using it very much because the places that this comes from bogs and peats, those are very important for the environment. And I don't think it's a good idea to dig them up. So I started experimenting with another fuel, which I think people in prehistoric times may well have used. And that's this. You might wonder what this is. I don't know if anybody can guess, but this is dried sheep's poo. It's dung from sheep. And if you collect this on a nice dry day and you dry it out completely, it will burn. And it burns very well at a nice high temperature. And if you put a pot in a fire made out of sheep poo and you get that pot really hot, then it will change from clay into pottery. And that means you won't be able to change it back into clay again if it gets wet. The fire was burning for probably a couple of hours. We started it off with wood and we heated the pot up very gradually because if you heat it up too quickly, the pot can break. It didn't break, and so we added our new fuel over the top of it, and that's burned out. The pot has got a little bit of damage, and this is something that happens a lot with prehistoric pots. We find it on pots, on archaeological excavations and pots in museums, and a small piece of the pot has actually broken off, and that is because when the fire got really hot, it heated up too quickly, and that put too much stress on the pot, and this little piece is broken off, and it would fit back on the side of the pot, and it's got a very different colour because this piece landed in a bit of the fire where there was much less smoke, so it hasn't gone black like the rest of the pot. But never mind. And we've been measuring the temperature in the fire as well. We have a small technical device attached to a piece of wire, and this is called a thermocouple. And it measures temperatures in the middle of the fire, and at the moment it's telling me the temperature was about 100 degrees at the bottom of the fire there, though the pot's a bit cooler than that. And we've got a special gun. It's a thermometer gun, and this will measure temperatures as well, and that's telling me that the side of the pot is 80 degrees. And I think that's just about cool enough to take out, although it is a bit hot for my hands, so I'm going to wear these special gloves to take the pot out of the fire. Now, you might be wondering why the pot was upside down. That's because the rim of the pot is the most delicate part, and we want that to cool down at the slowest rate. So we leave it in the fire the longest by having the pot upside down, and that means that that cools more slowly than the bottom of the pot, which is sticking up into the cold air. And I can just make a little noise, and that sounds very nice. That's the source of noise that we want, and that tells me that there aren't any cracks in the rim. If there's a crack in the rim, it makes a much duller sort of thud noise, but that ting is a good noise. So that pot is fully fired, and even though a bit broke off the bottom, it hasn't gone right through, and that means the pot can be used as soon as it's cooled down.